Welcome. So my name is Ronaldo Walcott, and I'm a faculty member at OISE UT. And it is my distinct pleasure to be asked to moderate this roundtable this afternoon. So we have four important scholars, critics, who will be presenting on Richard Fang's oeuvre. It is also my task to alert you to the fact that Professor Lisa Lowe is unfortunately not able to be with us because of an emergency that called her away to California. Just a couple of weeks ago in Cambridge, Professor Lowe was expressing to me excited anticipation in participating in this event. So we're sad that she can't be here today. We will miss her presence. In Professor Lowe's absence, the organizers have asked me to say a few words about Richard's work. I will make my comment as a way to introduce the speakers who will be more substantive than me. I am sure of that. So Errantry, the works of Richard Fang. Sometime around the fall of 1990, well over 50 students registered to take a course at OISE that was being offered by Roger Simon and Henry Giroux, who was visiting professor that term. Indeed, the course was so oversubscribed that Simon and Giroux had to split it into two, since no one was willing to drop the course to make the numbers manageable for teaching. Richard Fang was in one section and I was in the other. The course was an intense conversation on identity, politics, migration, representation, and so on, read through the works of Fanon, Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, and many others. In moments like these, retrospectives, nostalgia can be a useful way to critically engage thoughts, ideas, and political insights. Indeed, nostalgia is not always problematic. It can be an opening to critical re-engagements and can point to critical reassessments. It does not have to be sentimental. Many of the folks who participated in the two sections of that course engaged in vigorous debate, sometimes it was pretty painful and nasty, contestation and political action at what was the beginning of the waning of OISE as a significant graduate educational institution in this country. We did not know it then, but the early 1990s was the beginning of the end of the legendary OISE. Richard Fang and I were enrolled in graduate degrees around the same time at OISE. It was a time when it was possible to pursue scholarship in a wide array of areas at OISE, and in particular, cultural studies had come into its full possibilities as an area of intellectual maturity and inquiry that could authorize knowledge and its production across a wide range of formats and scholarly areas. Roger Simon guided many of us in our studies from 1990 till about 1998. And I'm marking that because I left OISE just prior to 98, so that's just my arbitrary marker. Obviously, Roger continued to teach well after that. I would never forget the screening of my mother's place at OISE sometime around 1991 in what was then the Speakers Series of Critical Pedagogy and Cultural Studies Forum, where faculty and students, internal and external to OISE, presented work in progress, as well as polished work ready for publication to the community. The Speakers Series was a place of intense debate. Fang's video ignited a robust debate about migration, class, ethnicity, and race. I played a small role in that debate, adding my own Black Caribbean inflected insights to the conversation that occurred after the screening. I was particularly intrigued by the representation of ethnicity and class in Richard's video essay on his mother. I still remember that some people felt it was in bad taste to raise such questions. Tensions ran high after the screening. I had been familiar with Richard's work before encountering him at OISE, but I got to know his work better while at OISE and much later while working with him when he was administrative director of the Center for Media and Culture in Education at OISE. Again, the center seemed to signal a possibility that quickly disappeared. And when Richard and I sat on the Fuse editorial collective, I also got to see a different side of his critical insights as an artist intellectual. While at CMCE, Richard worked with faculty and students to produce events that critically engage art, pedagogy, and politics. One of the most stunningly memorable of those events was the conference Terms of Engagement, which brought together filmmakers, academics, film archivists, among others, to engage the multiple dynamics of the moving image for memory, politics, pedagogy, and art. I nostalgically recall these moments because they allow me an avenue to make some broader comments about Richard's work as an artist intellectual. I early referred to Fang's works as video essays, especially the works beginning with My Mother's Place. Video essay is a term I borrowed from Ursula Beeman, and both Rich and I attended the conference that Ursula had organized on the video essay in Zurich sometime around 2002. Because in those works, Richard's narrative is equally as important as the images on the screen. His video essays orient and disorient. Pamela Rossi, writing of the video essay and Beeman's definition of it, states, and I quote, "In her commentary on video essays, Beeman characterizes them as part documentary, part art, transgressing the borders of both. In a documentary tradition, they engage reality, but their gaze is subjective, disassociative, and theoretically situated in post-colonial situations of diaspora, migration, and ambivalent experiences of nation, borders, and belonging. Likewise, as art, video essays concern more than aesthetics, since they are socially involved and explicitly political. Richard Fang's video essays exhibit a profound kind of rooted errantry, as the late Edward Glisson would put it. Indeed, I have been consistently struck by how Fang's video essays seem to always return to the Caribbean, more specifically Trinidad and Tobago, and nonetheless to seamlessly navigate the globe in a way that never eschews the nation, but does not make any significant claim on it either, whether it's Trinidad or Canada. There's a profound diasporicity in his work. But it is precisely the ways in which Trinidad and Tobago appears to fashion a certain kind of sensibility in Fang's work, a kind of roving around, a restlessness, but not one of chivalry, meant to save something or someone, that is most fascinating about his work for me. In fact, Fang's roving around is more tuned to a witnessing, a remembering, an ethical accounting, a reckoning with our multiple and conflicting inheritances, than an attempt to render transparent modes of belonging that are neither singular nor multiple. Indeed, Fang's contribution is like an ellipsis. The invitation is to continue onto and into conversation, not to define nor conclude or sum up. I see such engagements and practices most clearly in video essays like Seeing the Blood, Uncomfortable, and Tao. Nonetheless, in reviewing Richard's work for this event, I was struck by how profoundly Caribbean his work is too. By that, I mean that Fang's work fits well within the mobility of a certain Caribbean intellectual tradition, a tradition that seeks to acknowledge a complicated inheritance, and a tradition that is restless, that roves across ideas, places, roots, and roots. Such an inheritance is represented in Richard's work by a certain errantry that involves a search for a language with which to express cultural memory, to quote Laura U. Marx. Remaining in conversation with Marx, Fang's video's essays seem to both grieve and simultaneously excavate and reanimate the colonial violences, the absurdities as represented in a video like Islands of the Caribbean region, and that's modern Atlantic cultures and beyond, in a way to renew conversations that might provide a different lens on how our various intimacies are fashioned to invoke Professor Lisa Lowe in her absented presence. As an aside, I would say that Richard's work is suffused with a certain Caribbean humor as well, that gives it a certain intelligibility and another moment of intimacy, one of the region. Indeed, one of the aesthetic singularities of Fang's video essays is the ways in which he films or documents intimacy, bringing viewers into the otherwise privacy of lives that illuminate our collective experiences. Fang's autobiographical impulse comes to inform our collective cultural formation. Intimacy offers much more than private revelation in his works. Fang's video essays work against the public-private split, demonstrating how such a split is central to that which might prohibit or knowing more deeply or collective livable intimacies, especially those that are denied or made absent by ongoing coloniality. Even in Fang's early work, like Orientations, the aesthetic of intimacy is already present, or in a later video like School Fag made with Tim McCaskill, in which only the subject appears on the screen. Fang offers us intimacy that requires an ethical looking or viewing. Indeed, sometimes as a viewer of Fang's work, one can experience moments of discomfort, as if too much has been revealed. I certainly experienced this with Seeing the Blood. However, it is precisely the project of revelation and its provocation into conversation, into debate, and so on that makes Richard's work its most significant points, and so on that gives Richard's work, its most significant points of engagement for me. In some ways then, Fang's project might require us to think intimacy anew. Finally, let me say, before I turn to introducing the speakers, that Fang's work traverses a wide expanse of artistic, critical, and intellectual terrain. Richard has been at the forefront of debates on representation, cultural appropriation, art making, activism and its politics, art policy, and the radical work of making freedom appear in its broadest global forms. In this instance, I think of his work in the Palestinian freedom struggle and queer struggles. But his videos like Out of the Blue, Rex versus Singh, and Jihad point to the ongoing work with freedom and liberation as a consideration across all of Fang's work. As a queer artist, Fang's contributions continue to remind us that queer work exists beyond the intimacy of sexual identity, desire, and/or bedrooms. And yet he reminds us of this too, especially with its political edge in Dirty Laundry. In this regard, it seems to me that it is also possible to read Richard's work as the errant queer, roving beyond sexual identity to provoke conversations about what it means to be in a post-Columbus world, one in which one of its epicenters of invention, the Caribbean, continues to shape our intellectual inheritances globally. So to conclude with Edward Glisson, whom I borrow errantry from, who speaks Richard into being, Glisson writes, "His Elsewhere, by contrast, an island, above all, a conjectural space, where, apparently, even the poet, or in this case I replace poet with the video essays, birth already marked a margin. His Elsewhere is not like Segalin's, colored by a dream to be approached, a temptation to be satisfied. It was a given childhood, already the evidence of every possible elsewhere." Our first speaker this afternoon, Professor Bannon, was among the earliest critics to write on Black British cinema and to curate it here in Canada. Currently, she's organizing the Tri-Campus Retrospective and Symposium on the work of John Comfort that will happen at the end of November. Significantly, Cass Bannon has also taught me everything that I know about film. She's an amazing pedagogue. Speaking secondly is Roland Santos Coloma. He is a professor in the humanities, social sciences, and social justice education at OISE University of Toronto, where he's also associate chair of department. Before coming to OISE UT, Roland was a professor at Miami University in Ohio. Roland is a prolific researcher and writer. He's the editor of Postcolonial Challenges in Education. He's the co-editor of Filipinos in Canada, Disturbing Invisibility. And he's also co-editor of Asian American and Pacific Islanders, The State of Research. He's currently preparing 2 books for publication, a single-authored monograph entitled Imperial Fixations, Filipino Subjects on the United States Rule, and an edited collection called the Asian Canadian Studies Reader. Professor Coloma is the founder of the Asian Canadian Studies Network, and he's one of the hardest working scholars I know. He's also a dream to be a colleague since we share a department together. The third speaker will be Monica Kim Gagnon, sitting next to me, who is a professor at Concordia University in Montreal in the Department of Communication Studies. Monica is the author of Other Conundrums, Race, Culture, and Canadian Art, an editor with Richard Fang of 13 Conversations about art and cultural race politics. I'm going to translate the third book, which is in French. My French is terrible, into English. The third book is Territories and Trajectories. Professor Gagnon has been at the forefront of debates on art, artist activism, curatorial practices, and representation in Canada for over 2 decades, despite how young she looks. Monica is also a well-respected and productive curator, as well as being an artist. Her art criticism and theoretical work has appeared in numerous books, journals, magazines, and catalogs. Indeed, Professor Gagnon's contributions have been central to debates on race, culture, and art in Canada and beyond. And last but not least is Ramaba Espinay, who is an academic, a writer, and critic. At present, she's a professor of English at Seneca College. She also teaches post-colonial literature and women's studies at the University of Toronto, and is a fellow of CERLAC, which is the Center for Research in Latin American Caribbean at York University. Her published works include the novel The Swinging Bridge, a finalist for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize in 2003, and one of the texts chosen for the celebrated Robert Adams Lecture in Canada in the same year. The Swinging Bridge was also longlisted for the Impact Literary Prize in 2005 and has also been published in French. In 2008, Ramabaya received the Nicolas Guillen Prize for Philosophical Literature. Other publications include a collection of poetry, Nuclear Seasons, a performance piece, Indian Robber Talk, 2 children's books, The Princess of Spadina and Ninja's Carnival, and her short fiction and poetry have appeared in anthologies such as Trinidad Noir, Blue Latitudes, Green Cane and Juicy Flotsam, Beyond Sangre Grande, Another Way to Dance, and Wheel and Come Again. It's also appeared in the journal Small Acts and the Massachusetts Review. Ramabaya has also edited the renowned and very well-respected anthology Creation Fire, which is an anthology of Caribbean women's poetry in several languages, containing the work of 121 poets. Her field of academic research is post-colonial literature. So welcome our speakers.
Remarks towards thinking about the conditions that gave rise to Richard's rich body of work, as we say in the biz, a conjunctural analysis. But as looking around the room, my PowerPoints don't seem to be working, but looking around the room, I see that you don't need my PowerPoints because many of you lived through this history, and I'll be boring you to death. But for those who didn't live through it, I'll offer a few remarks. So speaking as a not-so-distant observer, I'll bullet a few elements that may have impacted Richard as he evolved as an artist. These include, but aren't limited to, the vibrant and politicized local state-funded video art community, queer activist enclaves like the Body Politic and grassroots activism, the emergence of the path-breaking Black British films, the increasing cultural capital of post-colonial and queer practice, queer theory, parlance, and practice, the rise of identity politics in the 90s, with its recurring dance between minoritarian and the national, to name but a few. And we find traces of these aspects evinced across Richard's growing body of work. And it could be argued that Richard indigenized trends that preoccupied emergent diasporic practitioners since the late 80s. Yet these developments were never adopted wholly. In short, I'll attempt to tease out, point out, given the time constraints, the local global connectivities of Richard's work. And it's this confluence, this interface of elements and their imbrication in the works themselves that makes Richard's output so exceptional, especially in a Canadian context. And rewatching Richard's work over the past few weeks was like pawing through a family album of sorts. And content-wise, obviously, that's a stretch, as I'm certainly not a member of Richard's identifiable minoritarian subjects, the people he screens. while signaling longevity, 30 years of work minus a year, rescreening the works recalled snapshots of a different time, offering valuable lessons in local historiography, while exemplifying a truly emergent practice in Raymond Williams' sense of the term. So we could say that my approach attempts to temper the first-time hagiographic valence that necessarily attends a retrospective as a construct in general. And this optic, of course, in no way undermines my genuine admiration, neither for the individual Richard nor his work. I did have some great slides, but I'm just going to point to just a few things that were happening in the 80s. From Richard's early video work, what some might call a queer mode of production is decidedly evident. And Toronto had an incredibly rich video art scene in the late 70s and the 80s. And this is just, decidedly, I think, highlighted by the camp impetus of General Idea and video artist Colin Campbell. But there isn't much of this pronounced strain in Richard's work, as you know. While slightly playful, Richard's early work seems driven more by immediacy, as redress, or more precisely said, to respond to states of emergency. Following his friend and collaborator John Grayson, Richard combined play and more overt politics. In the early 80s, a love-in of sorts was occurring at OISE, and this is where Richard completed his master's degree. There was a love-in, and there still is, given your topic, I'm fascinated to hear how it's evolved. There was a love-in with feminist pedagogy that celebrated autobiographical forms of knowledge-making. And paralleling this excitement was the knowledge generated by British cultural studies, a la Stuart Hall. So in this regard, Richard was a fellow traveler in a Black British film fan club, taking an early interest in their work that simultaneously validated and interrogated identity. And Richard interviewed Isaac Julian for Fuse in the late 80s, for example. And you get a sense here of the torch being passed, as if some of these preoccupations took root in Richard's work, namely how to negotiate multiple identities of ethnicity, race, and sexuality, while insisting on the importance of national belonging. So the emergence of films like Richard's, as well as fellow queer Asian artists like Midi Onodera and Paul Wong, from communities previously unheard from, disrupted former prescriptions of what constituted moving image practice in this country. Now, at the same time, roughly the late 80s, a subgenre came into fruition, the feminist hybrid documentary film. Influenced by, but not necessarily aligned with the avant-garde, this practice also evolved from the politics of locality. Committed to a referent, these works spoke from experience and/or particular localities, but material was approached in a less totalizing fashion than the realist documentary promulgated by the National Film Board of Canada, which tended to adopt the prevailing documentary techniques, variations of cinema direct, and/or more conventional modes existing at large. Avoiding both modernism's pyrotechnics and the pitfalls of a realist aesthetic, this new composite blended formal innovation with information, analysis, and politics. And when taken up with the immediacy of naming, this hybrid simultaneously put an essentialist subjectivity under erasure by problematizing the enunciation of first-person filmmaking. A non-authorial, but critical, autobiographical eye offered a center or focus to a work, while at the same time destabilizing the possibility of romantic self-expression. Now, the reasons for this shift in emphasis and style, and what could read like a confluence of contradictory impulses, are both numerous, specific, and now commonplace. 70s theorizing around issues of realism and self-reflexivity trickled into Canada in the 80s, offering new formulations that challenged preconceived misconceptions of documentary practice and shifted the frames of reference away from truth claims or content analysis to stress the affective power of documentary, focusing on form in general. Now, I would conjecture that Canada's context gave rise to Richard's works that both accepted and resisted a heavy reliance on aesthetics, neither rejecting the new strategies evident in film produced in this theoretical interlude, nor unabashedly embracing them. And the reasons for this are largely institutional ideological, and again, historical. Canada's film institutions, the NFB or the CBC, were not generally interested in films that pushed the boundaries of normative documentary form. Developing his skills in the video sector, Richard could skirt these restrictions and was able to produce works that were both politically grounded and formally engaging. Now, in hindsight, the idealization of self-reflexivity and critiques of realism promulgated by feminist film theory was not largely adopted by Richard. And I doubt that this was a willed disbelief in the then political promise of formal experimentation. I believe this wariness stemmed from a consideration of issues that were activated in relation to questions of audience and community. In the end, the contradictory pull of our Gersonian legacy, the will towards responsibility, kept Richard from abandoning the social and forging a unique practice that I believe is unique to this locality. The results are uncanny works, complexly situated imbrications that offer both an effective and a political engagement, proposing a nexus of fact and fiction, but never imposing a resolution. As such, Richard's works are neither avant-garde nor realist, embodying a situated but poetic knowledge that negotiates the in-between. And here the defining characters of Richard's works are specifically modes of address. And more often than not, they utilize, as Ronaldo said, the first person. Though this is not an authorial I used in the usual sense of an informational conduit to constitute narrational authority. Instead, voice negotiates a double-edged function, part narrator, part social actor, that suggests interiority or subjectivity. In this way, Richard's voice adds corporeal function in both a specific, individuated sense and a generalized status, representing different forms of difference as a totality. In other words, his biographical I, rather than an authorial I, suggests a subjectivity but does not speak for a collectivity. In Sea in the Blood, how many minutes? 1, 2. Oh, good, we're good. In Sea in the Blood, for example, Richard's most loved work, mine anyway, he crosses over from bad boy video practitioner out back to full-blown artist, in my view. And with C, Richard ups the stakes, right? Taking more time with the look of the work or its aesthetics. And we can see this even in the film that you saw this afternoon. Richard's section of Rex versus Singh is, formally gorgeous, innovated, rich, etc. But also experimenting with modes of address. Richard speaks around his sister, but not directly addressing her, not assigning her to a fixed designation. And the weight of history, her death, works against the demands of Richard's interrogation, and it's toing and froing. And it's this dialogic relationship that helps cement the film's first-person, double-voiced discourse. So, Sea in the Blood is in the tradition of the essay or diary film, where Richard plays the eye of the work while retrieving a history lesson. And he puts himself out there through his own examination of his relationship with his sister while trying to articulate his own identity. And this might sound like a finding oneself, consciousness-raising, nay, embarrassing work of white feminists in the 70s. Sea in the Blood does not in any way resemble the decidedly onastic efforts of that time. This is a highly conceived conceptual work where participant Richard investigates his family photographs and footage, but sidles up to an accepted truism, then circles back to illustrate its tenuous foundations, questioning the certainty of knowing in the first place. So we can say that Richard Fung, video artist, filmmaker, was made out of a number of historical circumstances that arose late last century. He's a walking embodiment, a poster boy for all of the tenets we academics hold near and dear as we insist upon and proselytize about intersectionality and multiple identity formation to our students. Yet there's always a touch of strategic essentialism in the mix, and I like that. But his work might be a handbook of exemplarity, but he's our Richard. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Tak, for this invitation. Thank you, Ronaldo, for the generous introduction. Thank you, Richard, for giving us opportunity to comment on your work and to celebrate your accomplishments. I also want to recognize that this discussion is happening on Indigenous land and to recognize the peoples of the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nation. I first encountered Richard's work in the early 1990s as an undergraduate in the United States at the University of California, Riverside, not in the formal setting of a university course, but rather in informal discussions with other Asian American and racialized minority students who were fighting for the establishment of ethnic studies there. Richard's now widely anthologized essay, Looking for My Penis, initially published in 1991, became for me, who at the time was grappling with internal questions of identity, sexuality, and intimacy, an important starting point for analyzing racialized desire and power relations. One of the statements in that essay, quote, "The gay Asian viewer is not constructed as sexual subject in any of the gay male porn that he reviewed, not on the screen, not as a viewer," serve as an important starting point in the intersectional analysis and politics of race, sexuality, and representation. And it is from this vantage point that I want to take up in this presentation. I did not meet Richard in person until I came to Toronto to join the OISE University of Toronto faculty in 2008. And now I have the pleasure of working with him alongside Amr Wahab, Fritz Pino, and Elisa Tika in a SSHRC-funded project on revisiting his first major video, Orientations. When I came to Canada and began immersing myself in the scholarly literature on race, gender, sexuality, and diaspora, especially in relation to Asians in Canada, I was quite surprised to find Richard's videos and essays not as robustly engaged by Canadian scholars. And this surprise really came about because of my training in Asian American Studies, where we've pretty much embraced Richard as one of our own. There are a few exceptions. Monica Gagnon's 2002 book, 13 Conversations About Art and Cultural Race Politics, Helen Lee and Kara Sakamoto's 2002 book, Unlike Mangoes in July, and more recently, Lily Cho's essay in 2008, Future Perfect Loss. And these are wonderful examples of the ways in which Canadian scholars have taken up Richard's creative and intellectual works. Yet, in my reading of the Canadian scholarly landscape, these are more exceptions rather than the rule. This is quite different, as I mentioned, in the United States, where Richard's work is more widely discussed, written about, and taught. And when Tak Fujitani and Lisa Yoneyama came to join the faculty a couple of years ago, this was one of our conversations in terms of the ways in which things are quite different in terms of the Asian American and Asian Canadian scene in relation to race, gender, and sexuality. Because when one takes a look at Asian American Studies readers and courses, the field of Asian American Studies has certainly claimed Richard as one of their own. So what about Canada? When I asked colleagues about what I perceived to be a relatively limited engagement in Richard's work here, a couple of general explanations emerge. One is Canadians find more recognition and success outside of Canada rather than within it. Think, for instance, of Canadian actors and singers who have made it to Hollywood, and I'm not going to list them.
Thank you.
This explanation points to comparatively more opportunities for artistic and intellectual engagement south of this border. But that's not necessarily the entire picture. Another explanation is the ways in which discourses of nationalism and multiculturalism in Canada focus on geopolitical boundaries and on singular identities. Hence, those who pursue works that index what Lisa Lowe has called the heterogeneity, hybridity, and multiplicity of differences become illegible and thus negligible within mainstream articulations and understandings. However, for my work and for my presentation this afternoon, I am more interested in asking, what are the consequences of such limited engagement and reception? What are its implications for analysis of race, sexuality, and intersectionality? For the development of Asian Canadian studies? For the imagining of an Asian Canadian queer history? And I use Richard's work as a point of departure in thinking about his artistic and scholarly productions as central for those of us who are interested in what can be considered as imagining an Asian Canadian queer history. In her essay, The Power of Sexuality, Jennifer Ting contends that sexuality is crucial to the emergence of an Asian American racial formation and pushes for its mobilization as a category of analysis to think about the intellectual and political work that it does for the field. Here I want to invoke Ting's argument as a way to think through discussions of critical race, feminist, and queer studies in Canada in general and in Asian Canadian studies in particular. It also helps me to consider my priorities, investments, and analytics as I delve into Asian Canadian studies. If one pursues archival research related to Asian Canadian queer history, one might conclude that it is a fairly recent phenomenon. Toronto-based organizations began in the 1980s, such as Gay Asians of Toronto in the early 1980s, while Kush and Asian Lesbians of Toronto were established in the late 1980s. There were festivals and conferences such as Celebration, organized by Gay Asians of Toronto, and Desh Pardesh by Kush. In 1988, Gay Asians of Toronto and Kush organized Unity Among Asians, a conference for Asian lesbians and gay men in North America. Their publications included magazines and newsletters such as Celebration, Kush Kayahal, Chota Kayal, and Sami Yoni. Examining other magazines such as The Body Politic that you mentioned and Asianadian provide insights how queer press address race and how racialized minority press address queer sexuality. To address the HIV/AIDS pandemic, organizations such as the South Asian AIDS Coalition, now the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention, and the Asian Community AIDS Services, which was an amalgamation of 3 different groups, emerged around the late 1980s and mid-1990s. In 1990, the feminist quarterly Fireweed published a special issue on Asian Canadian women that was inclusive of lesbian writing grounded in the belief that fighting homophobia is essential to our political struggles as Asian women. In 1996, Gay Asian Toronto published an oral history of gay Asians, and in 1998, Song Cho edited Rice, Explorations into Gay Asian Culture and Politics. I offer these broad brushstrokes to paint and draw attention to organizations, publications, events, and issues related to more recent Asian Canadian history, not only to suggest that there is important research to be done on these groups and their histories, but also to situate Richard's video orientations within this broader sociocultural and political milieu. In formulating an Asian Canadian queer history, Richard's video offers important analytical and methodological insights that work against what he pointed out last night, against romanticism and against nationalism. Taking these insights seriously and applying them to history, I'll do this very quickly. Taking this very, very seriously for history, we can certainly read these orientations can be read as part of an archive of the period I just outlined and pushes us to consider our investments in the categories that we use to make sense of identities and groupings. And here I talk about orientations as a way about rethinking what we use in terms of Asian and Asian Canadian and how the different subjects in that, what Rinaldo called video essay, gives us insights of the complexity and heterogeneity of those particular subjects. The other piece of the paper that I'm not going to be able to expand, but I could probably talk about during the Q&A, talks about what might it mean to read an archive. And I think Richard's work enables us to think about archive quite differently. For those of us who are historically minded, we can at least approach archival research in 3 ways. One is reading against the grain, and here I'm quite reminded of Rodisa Mawani's book, 2009 book, Colonial Proximities, in which she hints at same-sex intimacies as part and parcel of certain kind of moral regulation in British Columbia in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Another approach is what could be called reading along the grain, And here, Nayan Shah's 2011 book, in terms of stranger intimacy, provides us a certain kind of archival reading of legal documents of deviancy in terms of alleged sodomy and buggery cases. And here I'll end with what I think of what Richard's work provides. The third approach, which we might consider reading beyond the grain, takes us to the realm of the fantasy. In Richard's film Dirty Laundry, the Chinese-Canadian gay protagonist says, "I don't even know how to read this," after uncovering a concealed picture of his grandfather posed next to another man with their hands touching. According to Joan Scott, fantasy is the means by which real relations of identity between past and present are discovered and are forged, which enables individuals and groups to give themselves histories. It also serves as a formal mechanism for the articulation of scenarios that are at once historically specific in their articulations and transcendent of historical specificity. If we follow Scott's articulation of fantasy and history, Dirty Laundry offers a queer possibility of the past through imagined depiction of same-sex intimacies and relations. Through alternative representations of the otherwise, Richard's film provides a different ontology and epistemology for the narration of Asian Canadian queer histories. Thank you.